I'm Judge Rachelle Carnesale from the Fulton County Superior Court Bench, and I'm here today to read this book with you. Elizabeth Started All the Trouble. The book is written by Doreen Rappaport and illustrated by Matt Faulkner. Here we go. Over 235 years ago, Abigail Adams got a letter from her husband. John was in Philadelphia in a big room with lots of other men. The colonists had declared independence from Great Britain and were busy writing new laws for a new nation. Abigail was ecstatic. She wanted independence as much as John did, but she was worried. Would women be included in the new laws? She warned John that if women were not remembered, they would start their own revolution. John laughed at her. It took much longer than Abigail wanted for that revolution to begin, but it finally started 72 years later. Look, she's writing him a note. Remember the women. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and their husbands traveled 3,000 miles across the ocean to London. They were meeting people from all over the world who were working as hard as they were to end slavery. When they got to the meeting, Elizabeth and Lucretia found out that they were not allowed to be delegates. In fact, if women wanted to be there just to listen to the men speak, they had to sit behind a curtain so they wouldn't be seen. Elizabeth and Lucretia were shocked. How could men who were against slavery deny women their rights just because they were women? They had to do something to change this. Well, it took much longer than they would have liked, but on July 13th, 1848, Lucretia and Elizabeth met with 3 friends to plan a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss women's rights. The women knew they needed to write some kind of declaration so people would understand what they wanted, but what should they write? Elizabeth read aloud from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The women agreed that it was a great document, as far as it went. But Jefferson had left out some very important things. Elizabeth said that she would rewrite it. She did, and she gave it a new name, the Declaration of Sentiments. The women planned a 2-day convention to begin 6 days later. They put a notice about the meeting in a local newspaper. At that time of year in upstate New York, most women were very busy on the farms. The planners didn't think many would come. They were wrong about that. "300 women came from far and near, by horse, by wagon, some even walked. The convention had been planned just for women, but when 40 men showed up on the first day, the women let them in. The women didn't feel confident enough to lead the meeting. In those days, it wasn't considered proper for women to lead meetings if the men were present. They asked Lucretia's husband, James, to do it. For 2 days, things went along smoothly as one person after another made speeches. Elizabeth read and reread her declaration, paragraph by paragraph, and people discussed what she had written. Like the male colonists who had listed their grievances against the King of Great Britain, Elizabeth listed all the unfair laws against women written by men. It was a very long list. It was unfair that women couldn't go to college or become doctors or lawyers or ministers. It was unfair that women could not keep property they inherited. It was unfair that women had to give any money they earned to their husbands. Everyone agreed. No one could deny it. Everything Elizabeth said was true. Look, that lady in the back is super excited. But then, there was lots of debate over Elizabeth's statement that women deserved the right to vote, and it was their sacred duty to get it. The idea of women voting was too daring for most people at the convention, including many women. Out of 300 people, only 68 women and 32 men signed their names to Elizabeth's declaration. Elizabeth's husband didn't sign. He had left town when she told him what she was planning to say. When Elizabeth's father heard what she said, he rushed up to see if his daughter was insane. That's when the big trouble started. It had taken 72 years, but just like Abigail had predicted, Elizabeth's declaration started a revolution. Ministers, all men of course, spoke out against her ideas. Newspaper reporters, all men of course, wrote what they thought about her declaration. Lawmakers, all men of course, laughed. Elizabeth wasn't surprised that her idea shocked so many people. Neither was Lucretia. They knew it was going to be a long, hard fight before women won equality, but Elizabeth had no doubt they would succeed. With so many newspapers all over the country reporting on the Seneca Falls Convention, word spread about Elizabeth's ideas. Lots of women agreed with her. Meetings popped up in towns and cities in the North and Midwest. 1,000 women came to the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. See all the meetings? Sojourner Truth, who had escaped from slavery, went to a meeting in Ohio. She caused quite a stir when she reminded white women there that black women were treated even worse than they were. In the spring of 1851, a 31-year-old schoolteacher named Susan B. Anthony visited Elizabeth. The two women became fast friends. They traveled everywhere and made lots of speeches together. But after a while, it became too hard for Elizabeth to travel. She had to stay home and bake and cook and wash and sew and care for her children and husband. Susan B., who was single, went anywhere and everywhere. Other women hit the lecture trail too. Here's the Suffrage Express, with lots of heroes. Soon, women started doing what men and even some women called unladylike things. Amelia Bloomer promoted new, comfortable clothing for women. Women could hardly breathe or move before in their tight-laced long dresses with heavy petticoats underneath. Some petticoats weighed as much as 14 pounds. As if Amelia's clothing wasn't unladylike enough, Mary Leon opened a female seminary, known today as Mount Holyoke College. The women studied science and mathematics, geography, rhetoric, philosophy, astronomy, ancient and modern history, subjects that men studied in their colleges. There's that unladylike outfit. I like it. Those are cute boots. Two sisters, Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, became doctors. When no hospital would hire them, they set up their own clinic for women and children and a medical school for women. Antoinette Brown became a minister and preached in church. And then there was Lucy Stone. At her marriage ceremony to Henry Blackwell, one of Elizabeth and Emily's brothers, she refused to say she would obey her husband. Henry agreed. And Lucy kept her name after they were married. In snow and rain and hail, the suffragists traveled everywhere. Suffragist is a name for a woman who fought for the vote. They gave speeches even during blizzards. More times than not, they were mocked and booed by men and women too. But their hard work and dedication helped. In Massachusetts and New York, married women finally gained the right to own property and keep whatever money they earned. But no matter how many people the suffragists talked to, and no matter how many petitions they got signed, and no matter how hard they worked to win the right to vote, the lawmakers still refused to change the law. Did you see his newspaper? It says, "If women vote, disaster and ruin will overtake the nation." Scary. By April 1861, the issue of slavery split the country and led to a civil war between the North and South. Women on both sides of the conflict worked for the war effort, doing more unladylike things. They prepared and delivered supplies for the soldiers. They lived in tents on the battlefields and fed and nursed the wounded. Some women became spies. A few even dressed as men and fought in battle. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation. It freed over 3 million black men, women, and children in slavery. But it did not free enslaved African Americans everywhere in the United States. When the North won the war, the suffragists set out to change that. They held meetings and started a letter-writing campaign. They collected more than 400,000 signatures in support of abolition. On January 31st, 1865, the U.S. Congress passed the 13th Amendment, ending slavery everywhere in the United States. Then the lawmakers began debating giving the vote to black men. Now, Elizabeth thought, now is our chance to get the vote too, but they didn't. So the suffragists kept on traveling and making speeches. Susan B. racked up the most speeches, more than 75 each year for 45 years. Even people who opposed women voting agreed that Lucy Stone, too, was an especially great speaker. But the lawmakers didn't listen. Sojourner tried to vote in Battle Creek, Michigan, and was turned away. Susan B. was arrested and fined when she went to the polls in Rochester, New York. She refused to pay. Then, hooray for Wyoming! In 1869, women won the right to vote there. I'm from Wyoming. And Wyoming had the first lady governor, too. Next in Kansas, then Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. And then in Washington, California, Arizona, and Oregon. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. and Lucy Stone and Lucretia and Sojourner grew old and died. New women continued the fight. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were fed up. 69 years had passed since Elizabeth read her declaration, and women could only vote in 9 states. No more speeches, Lucy said. No more trying to win over male lawmakers. It was time to do something different to get attention, so the suffragists held a parade. On March 3, 1913, a day before President Wilson's inauguration, 8,000 women marched down the streets of Washington, D.C. Following them were 26 floats, 10 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds, and 6 chariots. Angry spectators shouted ugly names and shoved them. Soldiers had to be called in to stop the attacks. Even people who didn't believe that women should be allowed to vote were outraged at the treatment of the marchers. The suffragists kept on marching and talking to lawmakers. More lawmakers listened. Hooray for Montana and Nevada, 1914. Hooray for New York, 1917. Hooray for Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma, 1918. On January 10, 1917, the suffragists started picketing in front of the White House. In rain and snow and blistering heat, they stood silently with their signs. Angry mobs attacked them. The police did nothing to protect them, nor did they arrest any of their attackers. In the next 11 months, more than 200 women were arrested for picketing. Almost 100 women served time in prison. Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months and thrown into solitary confinement for 2 weeks with nothing to eat but bread and water. Lucy Burns and 40 other women were beaten. Other suffragists took their places in front of the White House. Newspapers wrote about the brutal treatment of the women. Support for their cause grew. A judge finally ruled that the arrests were unconstitutional and ordered the women freed. A year after the women started picketing, President Wilson declared his support for an amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote became the law. The lawmakers had finally done what Abigail Adams wanted the Founding Fathers to do in that big room in Philadelphia so long ago. The women had triumphed after battling for the vote for 72 years, but they knew their work was not over. There were still many unfair laws to change so that women could have true equality with men. And we're still working on it. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I enjoyed the book and I hope you do too. Bye.